I guess in this video what I'm trying to do is tell my story. I would like to say sorry to my family and my friends, and I promise I'll be back.
On a cold November night in Toronto, Tess Richey went out for drinks, danced with friends, and then never made it back home. At first, it seemed like a case that we've sadly heard all too many times before. A young woman disappears after a night out. But what unfolded next was not only far more sinister, but far more frustrating too. As her family frantically searched to find her, handing out flyers, calling hospitals, and begging anyone to help, the police basically completely dismissed their fears. The police believed that she'd probably just gone off to cool down, but sadly, they couldn't be any further from the truth. And 4 days later, it wouldn't be officers who found Tess, but her very own mother. And let's just say that the discovery she made was every parent's worst nightmare. But the tragedy doesn't end there, because eventually, surveillance footage would uncover several chilling details, and those details would expose a horrific crime with a horrible man behind it. A man that Tess had trusted that night, and someone who went from a stranger to charming to dangerous in a matter of minutes. Meanwhile, everyone on the outside saw him as a hero. Now, calling him a wolf in sheep's clothing honestly doesn't do it justice, because what you're about to see is one of the most disturbing transformations from, well, a hero to one of Canada's most hated names. And so, on that note, welcome back to Coffeehouse Crime, folks. My name is Adrian, and today we're looking at the heartbreaking case of Tess Richey, a small-time YouTuber who died from the thing she feared the most. If you're new here, be sure to subscribe to see more true crime every single week. And now, please grab yourself a coffee and let's get into it. This is the case of Tess Richey. Before we dive any deeper into the events of that night, let's first take a moment to talk about who Tess Richey really was. Born on November 30th, 1994 in North Bay, Ontario, Tess grew up in a bustling, loving family surrounded by siblings. She also had two dogs named Phil and Pearl, who were everything to her. And that's not just something to say here, because Tess was the type of person who would bend over backwards to help any living creature. She was a proud member of PETA, fiercely passionate about animal rights, and known for defending them in every aspect of her life. She had also studied at George Brown College, focusing on assaulted women's and children's counseling, which is a path that shows just how deeply she cared for other people too. As you can see, Tess didn't only believe in equality, but she lived it too, and she was prepared to make this her personal and professional path moving forward. So, she studied counseling for assaulted women and children because she wanted to make a difference for those who felt it the most, and she was willing to stand up for those who couldn't. However, the rather tragic thing here is that while she embraced the goodness in people, she would unfortunately be subjected to the evil and dark side too. We can see a glimpse of this from her YouTube channel. You see, even from a young age, she created content online. Just silly, light-hearted YouTube videos that revealed her humorous and goofy nature. But as she grew older, her channel and the motive behind it seemed to shift, and the skits that she once made gave way to something deeper and more personal. And in one of those videos, Tess would open up about something that was extremely raw for her, and something painful. She spoke about a moment that had clearly left a mark on her, a time when her former boyfriend had tragically assaulted her. As someone who stood up for victims, Tess had now sadly become one herself. This is not something that she could have ever controlled, but even still, she admitted that she felt embarrassed and even ashamed by it. The video wasn't performative, but brave. She talked about the pain, the emotional scars, and the way it followed her into everyday life. It was a small glimpse into the real Tess, vulnerable but strong all the same.
I guess in this video what I'm trying to do is tell my story. Because I know for me, when I was going through this, I was searching everywhere I could, trying to find somewhere where somebody would understand and be able to get what I was going through. And now I'm sitting here by myself and so confused and hurt why I let him have so much control. Sorry to my family. I'm so sorry. I was on the floor and I couldn't move. And he grabbed me by by my chest and pulled up and spit in my face and threw me back down.
And in one of her more powerful and emotionally charged videos, Tess defended a woman's right to feel confident and do as she pleased.
If I had lower self-esteem, I would probably be starving myself right now. But that's exactly what is happening to other women all over this country. So I have something to say. To all of you that have something nasty to say about me or other women that are built like me, women that sometimes or all the time look like this, women whose names you know, women whose names you don't, women who've been picked on, women whose husbands put them down, women at work or girls in school. I have one thing to say to you. Kiss my fat ass.
Now, things did seem to level out after these two videos, and it turns out that the program that Tess had attended at college was not for her either. With that in mind, she had a complete change of environment and also decided to pivot into something a little different. Changing gears, she pursued flight services at Seneca College, dreaming of becoming a flight attendant and seeing the world. I got the sense here that Tess never wanted to sit still, that she wanted to experience everything and help people along the way. At one point, she even decided to move to British Columbia for a seasonal job in planting trees while reconnecting with nature. And when that was done, she then returned to Toronto, living downtown while looking ahead for her next adventure. I think Tess was not really sure what to do next. Maybe it was in arts or even modeling. Whatever it was going to be, she had that spark to make it happen. Her friends described her as stunning, expressive, and creative. She loved pearls, makeup, fashion, and thrift store hunting, and was also known to be an avid runner. And when she wasn't out doing marathons, she was often behind a camera, indulging in her passion for photography. For those who knew Tess best, she was described to be warm, funny, and, well, a little bit stubborn. And although she could be fierce at times, she was also extraordinarily trustworthy and loving. So, when she suddenly failed to respond to any messages or phone calls on November the 25th, 2017, her family instantly knew that something was wrong. I know I say this all the time, but this really was not like Tess, at all. I mean, with her being so cautious and protective over women's safety, she would always share her live location with friends and family. But not this time. So, where did she go? It was at this point that Tess's family then contacted the police. But if anyone was counting on the police to do their due diligence and find her in good time, well, they were in for bitter disappointment. The date was November the 24th, 2017. It was a Friday, and the night began like so many others in downtown Toronto. The air was cold, fairy lights hung overhead, and music drifted through the doors of many packed bars. Meanwhile, adults escaped the working week with drinks, dancing, and late-night laughs. Tess was out with a close friend that evening, a friend named Riley Simmert. She had called Riley to help her forget about a few things. Unfortunately, Tess had just broken up with her boyfriend, and she needed to find some comfort. Looking to distract herself from the heartache, the two headed to Cruise and Tango's for a drink or two, which is a well-known gay bar in the Church and Wellesley village of the city. It's a lively place, known for its inclusive vibes, and a dance floor that stays packed until the early hours of the morning. The next part is a crucial detail for later in the video, but for Tess, who identified as bisexual, it was a familiar and welcoming space. The two ladies spent their evening at Cruise, drinking and socializing with those around them. But as the night wore on, they encountered a man. Someone that neither of them had ever seen before. The man's name was Kalen Schlatter, and at the time, he came across as just another friendly stranger, charming, charismatic, and blending in with the crowd. You see, he too identified as bisexual, but as opposed to Tess and her transparency, it was something that he tried to keep under wraps. At the young age of 21, Kalen was out alone, but Tess, who was ever kind and open, decided to let him into their conversations. Both she and Riley engaged with him, and at some point after 1 AM that morning, the three of them left Cruise and Tango's together, with Riley calling an Uber home shortly after. About 2 hours later, and at around 3 AM, the pair were seen on a surveillance camera walking near Dundonald Street, a quiet residential area which is just a few minutes away from the club. You can see from this grainy footage that the two stopped near a house that was under renovation. It was here that they paused and lingered in the area while they decided what to do next. It is worth noting that at this point in time, Tess had actually called an Uber, But for one reason or another, Tess and Kalen then made their way towards the house which was currently under construction. And then, nothing. This was the last time that Tess was seen alive. After that, she just suddenly disappeared. Within only a few hours, Rachel knew that something must have happened to her sister. You see, Tess would always share her live location when going out at night, and she would usually keep the text messages coming too. But this time, nothing. By sunrise, those red flags were undeniable. Tess hadn't come home, hadn't posted anything on social media, and hadn't read any of Rachel's messages. And as for someone who was practically glued to her phone 24/7, that was alarming. It was in that moment that Rachel decided to call their mother, and, both gripped with fear, they decided to contact the authorities. But like I said, if you think the police were going to do anything about this in due time, you'd be wrong. You have to remember here that at that point, nobody had seen the surveillance footage yet. All they knew is that she was at a gay bar the night before, and then, just like that, she was gone. Now, of course, at this point in time, there were two leading theories. The first one is that maybe Tess just wanted to blow off some steam and was out partying, which is what the officers wanted to believe. And the second was that maybe Tess was in danger. And of course, this theory is what her family feared the most. And of course, with Rachel and Christine believing one thing and officers believing the other, this created a great issue between the two parties. One that would never be mended. So, casting ourselves back to the night of her disappearance, and to be precise on the date, Tess vanished in the early hours of November the 25th, 2017, a time when Toronto was experiencing temperatures only just above freezing conditions. With frost in the air, this formidable weather was not on her side, and it definitely wasn't the kind of weather to disappear in, or the kind to go out and search for someone who has. By Saturday afternoon, Rachel and her mother were now in desperate panic. Rachel had spent the entire day calling Tess, texting her, and even reaching out to her friends. But sadly, nothing came back. Not a single hint or sign of her. By now, more than half a day had passed, and still, there were zero signs of life. So you can probably imagine just how desperate her friends and family were becoming. The wait was simply too much to handle, and so their mother, Christine, who was back at home in North Bay, drove 4 hours to join in on the search for her daughter, and by Sunday morning, she was there trying to find her. Christine's greatest fears was that the police seemed to be horrendously sluggish in their investigation, and if none of them were going to take this seriously, well, she would just have to take matters into her own hands. A thought that, unfortunately, would both confirm and forever curse her. By the time she arrived, Christine realized that her suspicions were in fact correct. There was no official search underway. No one was canvassing the streets, and despite filing a missing persons report, the police were not treating this like an emergency at all. Officers were behaving as if Tess had disappeared on her own volition. But her family, well, they of course knew better. And so, Christine decided to once again take matters into her own hands. Armed with only her phone and sheer desperation, she began the investigation by retracing her daughter's last known footsteps, knocking on doors, calling local businesses, and asking for access to any security footage they may find. Once again, it is worth highlighting that, at this stage, no surveillance footage from the night that Tess disappeared had been recovered. It was still as if she had walked into the night and never returned. As Sunday extended into Monday and then into Tuesday, the ridiculousness of this story had worsened. Police officers were still not treating her case seriously enough, and although efforts had slowly began to amp up, both Christine and Rachel still felt that most of the work was on them. And still, throughout all of this, there was no sign of Tess. That was until day 5. On November the 29th, and on a bitterly cold Wednesday morning, Christine once again found herself back on Church Street. Although it was there and still waiting to be found, no one had yet discovered the surveillance footage. But little did Christine know that her gut instinct was bang on the money. Scanning every corner, every alley, and every shadowed space, she focused her efforts on the construction site. And then, in the laneway behind a house on Dundonald Street, only steps away from where Tess had last been seen, she noticed something. She could see a stairwell descending into the ground, and so, cautiously approaching the stairway, she noticed a human-sized object lying at the bottom of it. And it was in that moment that everything changed. because, tragically, it was her daughter's body. And so, at long last, Tess had now finally been found, but it did come at a very grim cost, and it also became clear that this was not some mistake or misunderstanding, but the result of something far, far darker. I'm going to hammer this detail in several times throughout the video, but once again, it wasn't the police who found her body, not an officer, not a detective, not an investigator, but her very own mother. One can only imagine the psychological impact that this would have on Christine, and so it is no surprise that she was absolutely furious afterwards. Christine had done everything by the book. She filed the missing persons report, she called the police daily, and even begged them to help her. But still, no one listened. And in the end, it was her own 2 feet which led her to the truth, and only 40 meters from where her daughter disappeared. Not that anyone even knew that at the time, by the way, because officers still hadn't found the surveillance footage. And when they finally did, well, not only was it too late, but it also brought many more questions than answers. After Tess had been found at 582 Church Street, the Toronto Police Service finally intensified their efforts. However, for Tess's family and the rest of the community, this response came all too late. Their initial reaction had already eroded the family's trust, leaving many to question the authorities' commitment and competence to protect vulnerable individuals. And to be honest with you, I don't blame the family at all. The police's efforts here were shocking. On December the 1st, 2017, the autopsy results were finally released, revealing that Tess had died from neck compression, which is a clear sign of homicide. With that in mind, this revelation prompted the homicide unit to take over the case from the police, a move which was welcomed by, well, basically everyone. You could even see that the homicide investigation team were far more proactive, and from the moment that they took over, things seemed to change. They were more driven, more compassionate, and far more effective. And in this video right here, which was taken on the day that they announced a person of interest, you can even see how clear they wanted to make it that they were a different task force.
The family's on very good terms with the members of my team, and my partner just spoke with the family today and actually met with them. And I speak to Tess's mother probably twice a week. We treat every case of equal importance, and we follow the leads until we hopefully can make an arrest, and if we can't, immediately we keep working on it until we get to that stage where we can hopefully make an arrest. So, I mean, this is the kind of case where obviously you want to make an arrest because it's very high profile, and you know, Tess was a young innocent girl who, you know, obviously nothing like this should have ever happened to anybody, but it took a lot of work, and everybody worked very hard. Like I said, the members of the team and also our support units in the service, and we were lucky to be able to come to this successful conclusion.
It was only 2 days later, on December the 3rd, that newly elected detectives recovered surveillance footage from the surrounding area. This newly found footage showed Tess in the company of an unidentified male between 2 and 5 a.m. on the night she disappeared. And, of course, as we know, that would later turn out to be Kalen Schlatter. In an effort to identify Kalen, police released images to the public on December the 10th asking for Toronto's help. The community's response was both swift and overwhelming, with many tips now pointing towards Kalen. However, before they could even get a hold of him, it would be Kalen himself that decided to come forward. So, this is where things take a turn, and not just for the strange, but the downright sneaky. Although Kalen had come forward to identify himself as the man in those images, he was not really prepared to cooperate fully. While on the phone to Kalen, detectives asked him if he was willing to come down to the police station for some sort of interview. And although he agreed, he would only do it if his mother and father were with him. After arriving, he was then asked if he would provide any sort of formal statement, and that is when Kalen clammed up and exercised his right to remain silent. Now, quite understandably, this was viewed as an uncooperative move by the detectives, but then again, we are all told to lawyer up before we open our mouths. You see, Kalen's parents were quite eager to show how amazing their son was, and so when they joined him down at the police station, they came armed with a basket loaded full of baked cookies. of course handing it to the officers while reminding them that he was a hero only a few months prior. However, what they didn't realize was that while they were trying to sweeten the room, they accidentally gave the officers exactly what they needed. As the family left the station, detectives noticed Kalen placing an empty drinks bottle into a nearby bin, and just like that, they had leverage: DNA. The bottle was retrieved and then sent for DNA testing, and of course, if what they suspected was true, well, then this evidence would blow the case wide open. And that's because, tragically, semen had been found on Tess's body, and so, if the DNA evidence taken from that drinks bottle matched that of the sample, well, then they very likely had her killer. So, who exactly was Kalen Schlatter? Well, on paper, he actually seemed like a nice guy, known to police not as a criminal, but a good Samaritan instead. Only a few months before Tess's death, he made headlines for rushing to help a man who'd been attacked with a hammer just outside of his family home. Not only did Kalen manage to scare off the attacker, but he would also call the police and even administer first aid to the victim. On the inside, his parents proudly described him as kind, respectful, and well-mannered. And his friends would say that he was sweet, funny, and a little bit quirky. At the young age of 21, Kalen worked in property maintenance, primarily focusing on exterior repairs and landscaping. Before Tess's murder, there was no prior record and no red flags. And on the surface, Kalen seemed to be like just any other normal guy. But during the investigation, and when people began to realize that she had been murdered, a much darker truth began to unravel. Because Kalen was not just someone with a rough edge. He was a man with deeply disturbing sexual fixations. Fixations which particularly focused on a fetish for choking women. And this was not merely discovered from his shady internet search history, but it would also come from the mouths of several of his former partners. In fact, one of Kalen's ex-partners would even come forward to tell officers that he admitted to her that he became sexually excited by strangling women. Not only that, but he also told her that he never went ahead with it because he didn't trust himself to stop. She also claimed that he would regularly push the limits of what was acceptable in the bedroom, often being too rough or aggressive, and even not accepting no for an answer. With this information at hand, and a bunch of other evidence which we'll get to in a short while, Kalen was officially arrested on the 4th of February 2018 and charged with first-degree murder. But the interesting thing here is that the most damning piece of evidence wouldn't come from DNA or surveillance footage, it would come from Kalen's own mouth. And all of this would come out via a police sting operation. While awaiting his trial, undercover officers posed as inmates in a nearby cell, and over time, Kalen started to get cocky. Kalen talked about all sorts of creepy stuff, including how much he enjoyed violent sex and how he liked to convince women into it. He would even describe choking as a turn-on, which sure has its place for some people, but this was definitely not the right time to admit it. So, was Kalen really a good Samaritan, or more like a predator in the dark? So, before we get to the courtroom, let's first briefly go back to the night that Tess was murdered. On November the 24th, 2017, Tess and Riley headed out to Cruise and Tango's, where they partied into the early hours of the morning. At some point that night, they met Kalen. On the surface, he didn't seem to raise any red flags, but surveillance footage would later reveal that he had been prowling Church Street all evening. Security cameras captured him roaming the area, approaching multiple women, and not just casually. He was persistent and often invasive. Several women would later come forward to say that they had rejected him that night. He had propositioned them, tried to strike up conversation, and often lingered far too long when they said no. It was this same man who ultimately would latch onto Tess and her friend. Sometime around 1:30 AM, Tess and Riley left the club with Kalen in tow. Riley had been drinking and started to feel unwell, and so she decided to call an Uber and head home. The ride arrived a little while later, but as Riley got in, Tess chose to stay behind with Kalen while she waited for her own cab back. From there, surveillance footage tracked Tess and Kalen walking northbound. The two stopped at a 24-hour hot dog stand and then eventually made their way toward Dundonald Street, a quiet block which can be found only a few minutes away. However, what Tess didn't realize was that this was not just a random walk. Kalen had scoped out this exact street earlier in the night, probably recognizing that this would be a great place for some secrecy. Surveillance footage showed him lingering near the area where Tess's body was later discovered, suggesting that he may have have had this position in mind from the very beginning. At just before 4 AM, CCTV captured both Tess and Kalen walking into the laneway between the two homes on Dundonald Street. It was cold, the temperature only a few degrees above freezing, and the area was dimly lit and tucked away from the main road. That would be the last time that she was seen alive. But as for Kalen, well, the same camera would capture him leaving the area shortly after. It would take 2.5 years for his trial to finally begin, where, no surprise, he pleaded not guilty to first-degree murder. By the time the case reached the court, public interest had reached a boiling point, with many people across Canada hating the name Kalen Schlatter. At the heart of the prosecution's case was a damning timeline, carefully stitched together with surveillance footage, phone data, and DNA evidence. The prosecution argued that Tess did not want to be with Kalen, nor was she interested in a romantic or sexual encounter. In fact, they painted a very clear and disturbing picture that Tess was trying to leave him. She had even tried to call an Uber home, but Kalen was not prepared to be rejected again. He lured her into the stairwell, made a sexual advance, and when she turned him down, he strangled her with her own scarf. DNA evidence supported the prosecution's case. Not only was Kalen's semen found on Tess's pants, but his saliva was also detected on her bra, proving that there was some form of physical contact before her death. However, Kalen's defense had an entirely different story. They claimed that Tess was actually the one to lead Kalen to the stairwell to make out, and that while things did get physical, they didn't go the full way because Tess told him that she was on her period. According to Kalen, he then accidentally lost control in his own pants, if you get what I'm saying, before the two then parted ways amicably. Apparently, Tess did not want him to stay, and so he left her just there on the cold stairwell. He then walked part of the way back home, before then taking a cab and then an Uber. However, his story did not align with the timeline, the physical evidence, or the forensic data, and after weeks of legal testimonies, the jury returned with a unanimous verdict, ultimately finding Kalen guilty of first-degree murder. The atmosphere in the courtroom was thick, and while Tess's family cried quietly, Kalen showed almost no emotion whatsoever, only a brief nod while his eyes were lowered as the verdict was read out. Under Canadian law, first-degree murder carries an automatic life sentence with no chance of parole for a minimum of 25 years. Of course, this meaning that Kalen will be behind bars for a very long time. And from here on out, Kalen would no longer be remembered as some sort of good Samaritan, but instead as a predator, a murderer, and a freak. And deservedly so. You know, what I find absolutely insane here is that even after his trial, and after all of this evidence was laid bare for the entire world to see, Kalen still refused to admit that he had murdered Tess. It's as if the entire world can now truly see him for what he really is, a monster. And yet, even still, he's just standing there crying with his eyes closed. Tess's family would later speak of the devastating impact of her loss, and the trauma that Christine went through after finding her daughter dead in a stairwell. And unsurprisingly, the way that the early police investigation was handled added an entire layer of pain and frustration. But at least now, finally, justice had partially been served.
I'm just glad he's off the streets now too, and nobody else can be hurt by him ever again. Ever. I'll make sure of that too.
Sadly, Tess had to give up her life to catch a monster, but we got the monster.
The aftermath of Tess's murder did not only spark grief, but ignite a wave of public anger. Toronto police were at the center of this outrage, who faced sharp criticism for their handling of this case. Despite Tess being reported missing almost immediately, and despite her body being only 40 meters away from where she was last seen on camera, they failed to find her in the 4 days that they had before her own mother would instead. The fact that her body had been left undiscovered for 4 whole days, despite being in a highly visible area, was nothing short of infuriating. Faced with mounting backlash, Toronto police launched an internal review into their own handling of the case. Officials would eventually admit that they had fallen short, and so off the back of that discovery, they publicly apologized to the Richey family. However, by then, the damage had already been done. The case had already struck a nerve, especially among women. And yet again, as we see in many of these cases, Tess's death became a cry for safer public spaces, improved police response, and greater awareness around violence against women.
Thank you for listening to my story.
I think one of the most haunting details of this case actually comes from the videos that Tess created years before she was murdered. She had spoken openly about her fear of violence, especially from men in positions of trust, and when that fear became her reality, it left a devastating scar. It was a fear that had lived in her shadows for many, many years, and in some sort of sick and cruel twist of fate, it would even be the thing that eventually would bring her down. And I think that's pretty much all I have for today's video, folks. I wish I could end it on a more positive note, but unfortunately, there is nothing to say. I guess the only good thing I can say to end this video is that although Kalen left Tess in the dark, he is the one that will now rot in it instead. And I guess you could say that for several minutes of control, Kalen has now earned a lifetime without it. On that note, I'm going to wrap things up here today, folks. Thank you so much for watching today. I really do appreciate you being here. Before you go, please share your thoughts on this case. And as always, I'll see you again very shortly for another video, likely in a few days or a week. So, until that moment arrives, remember to look after yourselves, look after each other, and of course, stay curious. Thank you, and goodbye.